I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president slammed her hand on the table and called me a trespasser on common property. I just slid a folded packet of documents across the boardroom desk, let them sit in front of her for a moment, and watched her lawyer's expression fall as he flipped through the pages. He looked at the surveyor's seal, the county clerk's stamp, and finally the boundary line certificate filed with the state. The room went silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I didn't need to say anything else. They had cut my lock, seized my shed, and claimed it was theirs yet. The ink on that state-registered boundary line made their entire argument collapse like a paper tent in the rain. The funny part is, I hadn't come here looking for a fight. When I first moved out here, I wasn't thinking about neighbors, let alone lawyers or bylaws. I had found a modest piece of land with a small house and an old storage shed tucked in the back corner. Nothing fancy, nothing showy, just enough space for me to breathe after too many years of city noise and workplace politics. My plan was simple. Keep the house in decent shape, stack firewood by the shed, and maybe try my hand at a garden when spring rolled around. That shed, weathered as it was, held tools that had been my dad's worn hammers, a clunky vise, his old tackle box. Every time I slid that lock shut, it felt like closing the door on a memory that I could always open again. Quiet, ordinary things. That was all I wanted. The trouble started with a bright orange notice taped to my shed door. Unauthorized structure on common property, it said, as if the shed I'd been using for months somehow belonged to them. At first, I laughed at the absurdity. My deed was clear. The survey pin was still sticking out of the ground next to the shed, hammered in decades ago. But the HOA didn't care about pins or history. They fined me for unauthorized use, claimed I was encroaching, and told me the shed had to be removed. I walked the line myself with a tape measure, shaking my head, thinking it must be some clerical error. But 2 days later, I came home from work and found the lock cut clean through, the doors thrown open, and half the contents dragged out onto the grass like a yard sale I had agreed to host. They'd seized my shed, declared it to community property, and told me I was trespassing on my own land. I tried to reason with them at first. I sent emails with copies of my deed attached, highlighting the boundary descriptions. I asked for a simple sit-down to compare plats. Instead of a meeting, I got more fines. Failure to comply, te calez Italiano. A few neighbors I had chatted with early on stopped waving. One even muttered that we all have to follow the rules. It was surreal, like I'd stumbled into a play where everyone knew their lines but me. T said wasn't T about aesthetics or property value. It was about power, and I started to realize that no amount of polite explanation was going to move people who thrived on control. That was the night I stopped drafting emails and started pulling records. I spent evenings in my kitchen with maps spread out like battle plans. County GIS surveys, old subdivision plats, even microfilmed records from the 1970s, when the neighborhood was first carved out of farmland. And there it was, the faint line, the overlooked signature from a state surveyor. The correction plat, filed years later but never adopted into the HOA's own tidy little maps. My shed sat firmly on my parcel, inside a boundary line that wasn't just thrown, it was state registered, sealed, and stamped. If the HOA wanted to argue with that, they'd have to argue with the Department of Natural Resources, not me. I kept copies in a binder, duplicates in a fireproof box, and digital scans on a flash drive. Every notice they taped to my door, every fine they mailed, I logged and dated. Neighbors stopped talking to me altogether, but by then I was past caring. My focus had narrowed to a single, sharp point. When the next board meeting came around, I didn't storm in. I signed the attendance sheet, sat quietly in the back, and waited. They went through their usual motions, painting colors, mailbox heights, holiday decorations before they got to me. The president puffed up, waving her papers, and accused me of trespassing on HOA land. That's when I stood, walked to the table, and set my binder down. No speech, no yelling, just the slow slide of documents across the polished surface. The lawyer leaned in, flipped a few pages, and froze. His eyes darted to the seal, then to me, then back to the president. I could almost feel the gears grinding in his head. The silence stretched long enough for everyone in the room to know what it meant. Their claim wasn't just weak, it was legally indefensible. After that night, the tone shifted. The fines stopped arriving. The orange noches disappeared. I got a formal letter more polite than any of the threats saying there had been a boundary misunderstanding. The shed, which had apparently been a battleground, suddenly didn't matter to them anymore. Within a month, 2 board members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. The president stayed on, but she stopped making eye contact when I drove past. A few neighbors went back to waving, cautiously, as if I might still hold some secret weapon in my back pocket. My life didn't transform overnight, but the noise faded. I could stack firewood again without worrying about someone photographing me. I could unlock the shed without finding my tools scattered across the lawn. The garden sprouted in spring, just like I'd hoped. And in the evenings, when I turned the key on that lock, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. They wanted to break me with petty rules and fabricated authority. Instead, they ran headlong into a boundary line they couldn't erase. Now when I walk past the HOA office, I don't smile and I don't scowl. I just keep walking. They know what I know, that the shed still stands, locked and solid, because it was never theirs to take. And that quiet fact is worth more than any apology. They'll never say,